Welcome back to Vaulted World Secrets, and if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found us. Thank you for spending your time here tonight. Before we begin, the ancient Egyptians believed the dead could speak directly to the living, and that ignoring them carried consequences no physician could treat. Have you ever felt that something in a place was watching you? Something that did not belong to the living world? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Now let's begin. Making that as in reason. There is a room beneath the temple complex at Karnak that no excavation team has formally catalogued. Not because it has never been found, but because what was found inside it has never been fully described in any published report. The archaeologists who entered it in the late 1980s noted its existence in a single line of a field journal, and then the entry stops. The line that follows it belongs to a different day, a different site, and a different tone, entirely lighter, more routine, the handwriting slightly different in pressure, as though the person who wrote the days that followed was working to appear normal on paper. Whatever was in that room was not written down, or it was written down, and that writing has since been removed from the accessible record. This detail will matter. But it comes much later, because the story must begin where all things in ancient Egypt ultimately begin. It must begin with the dead. By the time of the late period, roughly 664 years before the Common Era, through to the final decades before the Roman annexation, Thebes had already been a city of the dead for more than 1,000 years. It sat on the east bank of the Nile in the region the ancient Egyptians called Waset, and it had served at various points as the capital of the known world, the religious heart of an empire that stretched from the Levantine coast to the fourth cataract of the Nile, and the burial ground for generations of pharaohs whose names were carved into stone walls with the explicit understanding that those names would endure forever. Many of them did, some of them did not. And it is the ones whose names did not survive, or whose names were deliberately, methodically, violently removed who concern this account most deeply. The Nile in the late period ran as it always had. Slow, heavy, and brown, with the suspended silt of Central Africa. Its surface in the summer months was so flat and so bright under the midday sun that it was almost impossible to look at directly. The air above Thebes in those months was dense with heat, not the moving heat of wind, but a static, pressurized heat that accumulated in stone surfaces and remained there, radiating back into the night long after the sun had gone below the western cliffs. And it is the western cliffs that matter here, because behind them, cut into the limestone of the plateau above the floodplain, sat the Valley of the Kings. By the late period, the era of new royal burials in the valley had already ended. The last pharaoh interred there had been Ramesses XI, more than 3 centuries before the period described in this account. What remained in the late period were the tombs themselves, sealed, watched, maintained, and feared with a consistency that suggests the priests and guards assigned to the necropolis had specific, documented reasons for their vigilance. At night, the desert cooled rapidly. Stone that had held the day's heat for hours released it in a slow, mineral exhalation, and the air that rose from the limestone surface of the burial grounds carried within it a quality that Egyptian ritual texts describe with remarkable specificity. It smelled in the language of the texts, of the breath, of the Duat. The Duat was the underworld realm, the region through which the sun god Ra was believed to travel each night in his solar bark, moving through 12 hours of absolute darkness before emerging at dawn transformed. The dead of Egypt accompanied him on this journey, or at least attempted to. Whether they succeeded depended entirely on whether the preparations made for them by the living had been adequate, whether their tombs remained intact, whether their names remained legible on the walls, whether the offerings continued to come. The people who lived in and around Thebes during the late period understood the dead not as a category of the past, but as an ongoing and participatory presence in the world of the living. This was not a metaphor, and it was not simply consolation theology of the kind that every culture develops around the fact of death. It was a functional, operational reality around which Egyptian daily life was organized with the same practical attention that was given to flood management, grain storage, and tax collection. The dead had needs. The dead had legal standing. The dead could act in the world of the living, for good or for harm, and the mechanisms for managing those actions were codified, staffed, budgeted for, and held almost exclusively by the priests. The Egyptian understanding of the human soul was not a simple binary of body and spirit. It was a complex architecture of distinct components, each with different properties and different relationships to the physical world. The Ka was a kind of vital double, created at birth, alongside the physical body. It remained tied to the body and to the tomb after death, requiring the continued provision of offerings to sustain it. The Ba was more mobile, depicted in Egyptian art as a human-headed bird. It was capable of leaving the tomb at night and moving through the world, experiencing the world, even taking form in the world under certain conditions. The Ak was the transfigured spirit, the luminous form that a deceased person achieved after successfully navigating the trials of the afterlife, and the Ak, unlike the Ka or the Ba, could interact with the living in ways that were direct, purposeful, and often unwelcome. An Aak that had been wronged was an Aak that could reach back across the boundary between the living and the dead and make demands that the living were not in a position to refuse, not safely. In Thebes during the late period, the priestly class was not a peripheral institution existing at the margins of political life. The Temple of Karnak alone employed thousands of individuals across its vast complex of sanctuaries, administrative buildings, granaries, livestock enclosures, workshops, and sacred lakes. The priests of Amun, the principal deity of Thebes, whose name meant simply the Hidden One, had wielded influence that at various points in Egyptian history had exceeded that of the pharaoh. During the 21st dynasty, several centuries before the period under examination, the high priests of Amun had governed Upper Egypt as effective theocrats, issuing decrees in the name of the god rather than the crown. By the late period, that specific concentration of power had been broken and partially redistributed, but the institutional memory of it, and more importantly, the institutional knowledge that had accumulated over centuries, remained embedded in the rituals, the hierarchies, the libraries, and especially in the texts that were kept in the temple's restricted archives, accessible only to those with the appropriate rank and the appropriate understanding of what they were reading. It is within those texts that the first evidence of what this account concerns begins to accumulate. Egyptian funerary literature from the late period contains numerous references to a category of the dead that scholars have translated variously as the restless ones, the unquiet dead, or in the most direct rendering, those who have not reached their place. These were not people who had simply died. Every person who died became, in some technical and administrative sense, a member of the world of the dead. They entered a system, a bureaucracy of the afterlife that mirrored the bureaucratic structures of the living Egyptian state with an exactness that was neither coincidental nor metaphorical. It was intentional design, the living world built in deliberate reflection of the divine order that governed what came after it. The unquiet dead were something specific and different. They were people who had died under conditions that prevented their proper integration into that system. Their tombs had been violated. Their names had been erased from the walls. Their funerary rites had been conducted incorrectly, incompletely, or not at all. Their offerings had ceased. Their bodies had been disturbed, moved, or destroyed. Or, and this is the category that appears most frequently in the ritual texts produced in and around Thebes, they had died in a state of active, unresolved grievance. They were waiting for something, for acknowledgement, for restitution, for justice, for the specific correction of a specific wrong, and they were willing to wait across the boundary between the living and the dead for as long as it took. The Egyptian term for the condition of such spirits appears in the ritual papyri in several overlapping forms, but the most common translates with uncomfortable precision as the dead in the body, a phrase that describes a soul that has not fully dissolved into its post-mortem state, that is still, in some terrible and physical sense, present, still anchored to the world of the living by the weight of what it had not yet received, still capable of reaching back, still watching, still waiting. And in the cases that require the involvement of the specialized priesthood, still speaking, the rituals designed to manage encounters with these spirits were the exclusive province of a specific and largely unpublicized subset of priests within the Theban temple hierarchy. Not all priests were equipped or authorized to deal with the unquiet dead. The standard priestly hierarchy, the Wab priests who maintained ritual purity and performed the daily duties of washing and dressing the divine statues, the lector priests who read the sacred texts aloud during ceremonies, the Sem priests who presided over funerary rites and wore the distinctive leopard skin vestment. These were the visible and functioning clergy of daily temple life. The men and women whose roles appeared in administrative records and carved reliefs and formal dedications on the temple walls. But alongside them, in a parallel structure that the temple administration maintained in its records but did not publicize, were the priests designated by a title that has been reconstructed by scholars as meaning approximately the servants of the god of the matter at hand. The matter at hand, in their designation, was always the same. It was the dead who had returned and the living who needed help managing the encounter. What these priests did when a case was brought to them followed a structure that has been partially reconstructed from surviving ritual papyri found in and around the Theban necropolis, in the storerooms of now dismantled mortuary temples, and in several private collections whose provenance is not entirely clear. The process began with something that is perhaps the most unsettling element of the entire system, precisely because it implies a bureaucratic framework, a procedural normalcy built around the baseline assumption that the dead communicated grievances that required official response on a regular and expected basis. A formal complaint was filed. Someone, a family member, a neighbor, a priest who had experienced something in the temple complex, a guard who had noticed something in the necropolis, would bring the matter to the appropriate temple office. The complaint was received, assessed, categorized, and assigned. The paperwork exists, or at least some of it does. The categories of complaint listed in the surviving administrative fragments are varied and specific. There is a category for tombs that have been entered. There is a category for names that have been damaged. There is a category for offerings that have not been delivered. There is a category described only as the continuation of a previous matter, which implies cases that were not resolved on first attempt and required repeated intervention, and which appears in the records with a frequency that is itself a statement about the limits of the rituals. Once the complaint was categorized and assigned, the physical preparation of the ritual environment began. The inner sanctuaries of Karnak, particularly those within the precinct of Mut, the goddess of death and motherhood, whose walled enclosure sat at the southern end of the processional way, connecting Karnak to the temple at Luxor, contained chambers that were architecturally designed for this specific purpose. They were not incidental spaces pressed into service for lack of alternatives. They were purpose-built, their dimensions and orientations calibrated to the ritual requirements described in texts that predate the construction of the chambers themselves, suggesting that the chambers were built to a specification that had already been established in writing before the first stone was laid. They were small rooms, deliberately small, large enough for the priests who would occupy them and for the ritual materials they would bring, and not large enough for anything else. The walls were thick limestone blocks, cut with the characteristic precision of Ptolemaic-era construction, fitted without mortar in the inner courses, relying on weight and exactness of cut to hold their position. The ceilings were low enough that a tall man standing in the center of the room would feel the stone above without raising his arm fully. The corridors that led to these rooms were narrower still, lined floor to ceiling with protective texts carved directly into the stone, not painted, not applied in any removable medium, but incised into the material of the walls themselves, as though the protection they afforded needed to be structural rather than decorative. The air inside these rooms was still in a way that outdoor air is never still, not simply quiet, not simply enclosed, still in the way that air becomes still when it has been sealed away from the movement of the world for long enough that it has become a different kind of thing, pressurized, dense, carrying a quality of accumulation, that the priests noted in their ritual accounts with specific language. The torches they carried into these chambers burned differently than torches burned in open air. The flame did not flicker. It burned steadily, consuming the available oxygen in a manner that produced more light and less movement than was typical. In several ritual accounts, the flame is described as bending toward the wall, rather than rising vertically, as though something in the stone itself was drawing air inward. The priests noted this without alarm. It was expected. It was, in fact, one of the signs that the room was functioning correctly. The priests would enter these chambers in groups whose number was not arbitrary. Egyptian ritual mathematics assigned specific protective values to odd numbers, and the groupings were calibrated precisely to the severity of the case, being addressed 3 for minor complaints involving damaged property or a single broken element of the funerary provision, 5 for cases where the disturbance had been ongoing for more than one season, and 7 for the most serious category, which the ritual texts describe as a voice that has been speaking without cessation. 7 priests in full ritual garments, carrying the complete sequence of protective amulets specified in the relevant texts: carnelian djed pillars for stability, green feldspar heart amulets, small figures of Thoth as the divine scribe and mediator, and the papyri that contained the ritual formulae. The papyri were not read aloud on the approach. They were carried, held close to the body. The words on them were present but silent. To speak them in the corridor before the ritual's prescribed moment was considered in the texts to be not an act of protection but an act of invitation, as though calling out to confirm that you were on your way and would arrive shortly. The corridor itself enforced its own silence. In those narrow stone passages, sound behaved strangely. The soft fall of linen sandals on dressed limestone produced a short, flat echo that the walls cut off almost at the moment of its making, as though the stone were refusing to let the sound travel. Priests working these cases noted that the echo shortened further the closer they came to the inner chamber, until in the final approach there was no echo at all, only a dense and swallowing quiet that pressed against the ears from both sides at once. It was, the texts suggest, considered a threshold. The point at which the corridor stopped sounding like a place the living moved through and began to sound like something else entirely. Fix 1 echo plus stone texture. The offerings prepared for these rituals differed from the standard daily offerings made in the main temple halls, in ways that the surviving texts describe with careful specificity and modern scholars have found difficult to fully account. For within the known pharmacological and botanical record of ancient Egypt, where ordinary temple offerings consisted of bread baked from emmer wheat, beer brewed from barley, vegetables from the temple gardens, and incense resins imported from Punt, the materials assembled for the rituals of the unquiet dead included plant substances that grow only at the desert margin, at the exact line where irrigated soil ends and true arid sand begins, in a narrow band of transitional ground that the Egyptians considered a liminal space, belonging fully to neither the world of the living nor the world of the dead. These plants are described in the ritual texts by names that do not correspond precisely to any species in the modern botanical record of the region, a fact that scholars have noted and not resolved. The offerings also included the fat of specific animals rendered under specific conditions of the lunar cycle, and a material described by a term that translators have rendered, with varying degrees of discomfort, as the red of what was once living. The interpretations of this phrase converge across independent, scholarly efforts on approximately the same conclusion. They do not state it directly in published work. It is left, in most cases, as a translation note at the bottom of a page. These offerings were not placed on altars. They were placed directly on the floor of the inner chamber in an arrangement that corresponds, in the ritual papyri, to a specific directional orientation positioned toward the west, the direction of the setting sun, the direction of the dead. The priest who laid the offerings knelt to place each item on the floor stone with both hands, and the accounts note with the same matter-of-fact precision that characterizes all of these records that the floor stone was cold in a way that limestone should not be cold after a day of Theban heat, cold in a way that moved up through the hands and into the wrists and did not entirely leave when the priest stood again and stepped back. The surface of the stone was rough at the cut edges where the blocks met, smooth and faintly waxy at the center from the accumulated residue of decades of ritual use offerings laid and removed, oils applied and absorbed, the stone itself slowly becoming something other than plain rock through the sheer accumulation of what had been done upon it. Fix one cant, stone texture. The offerings were laid out, and then the priests withdrew to the outer corridor. The stone door of the inner chamber was pulled closed but not sealed. The ritual texts are precise about this. The door was left open by a gap, described in one text as wide enough for a breath but not a hand. The air could move between the corridor and the sealed chamber. Whatever was in the chamber could, in principle, move between the two spaces. And then the priests waited in the corridor, in silence, in the particular quality of darkness that existed in these inner precincts of the mutt enclosure, where the torchlight did not fully reach the ceiling, and the painted figures on the walls absorbed, rather than reflected, what light there was. What they were waiting for is described across multiple independent ritual texts, with a consistency that is itself notable because the various texts appear to have been produced by different hands in different periods and different institutional contexts, and yet the description of what the priest experienced in the corridor is essentially identical across all of them. They were waiting for what the texts describe as a sound beneath sound, not a voice in the sense of articulated language, not a physical movement, not the scrape of stone or the shifting of an object or a footfall. A pressure change in the air of the corridor that the attending priests felt in the chest rather than perceived with the ears, as though the atmosphere of the space had briefly altered its density. When this occurred, the lead priest spoke the first of the ritual formulae. It was an acknowledgement. It stated, in the formal register of late-period priestly language, that the complaint had been received by the temple administration, that the priests of the relevant office were present and attending, and that the administration was prepared to hear what was required. And this is the element of the ritual structure that has most consistently resisted placement within standard frameworks of Egyptian religious practice. The formula asked the spirit to specify its demand. Not the demand as the living relatives had described it, not the demand as it appeared in the administrative complaint. The ritual asked the spirit directly, in the sealed chamber, through the gap in the door that was wide enough for a breath, to name what it wanted. The assumption embedded in this procedure is that the communication would be received and would be specific enough to act on. And the subsequent stages of the ritual, which include different response sequences depending on what category of demand is communicated, suggest that this assumption was not theoretical, it was operational. It had been tested, and the ritual had been structured around the results. The letters to the dead form the most direct surviving evidence of the Egyptian belief that the living and the dead could correspond, and they are among the most extraordinary documents produced by any ancient civilization, precisely because of the social and administrative reality they imply. These were physical objects written on papyrus, on pottery sherds, on strips of linen deposited in tombs, placed in offering bowls, left at the edges of the necropolis. They were addressed to specific individuals who had died. They make requests. They present arguments. They appeal to the relationship that existed between the writer and the deceased. The Middle Kingdom examples are often gentle. A widow asking her deceased husband to advocate for her in a property dispute with his living relatives, a man asking his dead father to intercede on behalf of a sick child. By the late period, the register shifts. Several letters that have been associated with the Theban priestly records are not petitions, they are notices. They inform a deceased individual that their complaint has been logged. They confirm receipt. They read as administrative correspondence rather than personal letters. And what they most closely resemble, if one were to reach for a modern parallel, is the kind of letter a local authority sends to acknowledge that a formal grievance has been filed and is under review. One document in particular, held in a European museum collection, translated in the 1960s. The full translation, never widely circulated, records a communication that moves in the opposite direction from all conventional examples. It is not a letter from the living to the dead. It is a record, made by priests, of a communication received from the dead. The deceased individual's name has been abraded from the text at some point after the document's composition, the abrasion done with sufficient care that the surrounding text was not damaged. This was not accidental erosion. Someone knew precisely what was in this document and chose to remove the one detail that would allow the complaint to be officially attributed and therefore officially processed by the temple administration. A complaint without a named complainant could not be entered into the active case record. It could not be assigned. It could not be formally acknowledged. It would exist in the administrative framework the priests had built as nothing as a communication from no one, received by no one, requiring no response. Whoever removed the name understood the system well enough to use it as a mechanism of erasure, and whoever removed it chose, despite that understanding, to leave the rest of the document intact. The complaint itself remained. Only the name that would have given it procedural force was gone. Fixed to abraded name logic, the communication recorded describes, in organized and specific language, that the tomb of the speaker has been entered by individuals without authorization, that 3 objects of ritual significance have been removed, that the name of the speaker has been damaged in 3 specific locations on the tomb wall, and that if restitution is not made before a time described by a term that translates to something approximately equivalent to the next flooding of the river, consequences will follow that the current priests of the temple are not equipped to contain. The final phrase of the document, before the abrasion of the name and the abrupt end of the text, uses a verb form that Egyptian grammatical analysis categorizes as the declarative future of absolute certainty, not the conditional future, not the hopeful or threatening future, the future that describes what will happen because the speaker has determined it, and the determination is not subject to revision. The physical document itself carries something that the scholars who examined it noted and did not explain. It had been folded in a specific pattern, the folds precise and deliberate. When the examining scholars attempted to unfold it fully, they found that the innermost fold had been sealed with a substance that held the layers together from the inside, not wax, not resin, not any of the adhesive materials documented in Egyptian papyrus preparation. A laboratory analysis was conducted. The results were filed. Those results do not appear in any subsequent publication about the document. When researchers have since requested access to the laboratory report through the museum's archival system, they have been informed that it cannot be located. The record of the analysis exists. The administrative log shows that it was conducted, shows the date, shows the name of the facility. The report itself is not there. It is listed in the archive catalog. It simply does not exist in the location where the catalog says it should be. This pattern information gathered, assessment conducted, results in inaccessible repeats across the archaeological and institutional record of the Theban priestly ritual sites with a regularity that, once noticed, is difficult to stop noticing. It is not uniform suppression. There is no single authority that can be identified as making these omissions centrally. It appears instead to be distributed, collective, and apparently arrived at, without formal coordination, a series of independent decisions by independent institutions and individuals that have produced, in aggregate, an effect that is indistinguishable from deliberate concealment. The rituals of the specialized priesthood could accomplish specific things, and the texts are clear about what those things were. They could establish formal communication with the unquiet dead. They could convey the administration's acknowledgement of the grievance. They could perform the restorative actions that fell within the temple's institutional capacity, repairing a damaged tomb wall, restoring a name that had been partially erased, resuming the provision of offerings that had lapsed. What the rituals could not do is described in the texts with equal clarity. They could not compel. They could not force the spirit to accept an inadequate resolution. They could not, in any framework the Egyptians possessed, simply end the matter if the spirit determined that the matter had not been adequately resolved. The priests were not exorcists in any sense that later religious traditions would recognize. They were intermediaries. They were negotiators. And, like all negotiators, their effectiveness was contingent on both parties being willing to reach an agreement on terms that both found acceptable. When the dead were not satisfied with what the temple could or would offer, the administrative records note this outcome in language that is almost aggressively matter-of-fact. A brief notation. The situation remains unresolved. The ritual will be repeated at the next prescribed interval. In the interim, the following precautions should be observed by all personnel working in the affected area of the complex. The precautions are enumerated. They include specific restrictions on working alone in certain parts of the complex after the evening meal. They include requirements to carry specific protective texts written on small pieces of linen, held in the closed hand, not read, not displayed, simply held, because the act of physical contact with the protective text was considered to have its own efficacy independent of comprehension or vocalization. They include instructions for the placement of protective objects at the thresholds of sleeping areas within the temple residential quarters. And in one set of precautions associated with a prolonged case from the early Ptolemaic period, a case that the records indicate had been active for more than 2 full years, at the time the precautions were issued, there is a requirement that junior priests be accompanied at all times by at least one senior colleague, with the stated rationale that the spirit in question had demonstrated a preference for approaching those who were alone. The most significant unresolved case in the Theban priestly records from this era does not have a name. It is referred to in the surviving administrative texts by a series of notations that scholars have translated as the ongoing matter, the matter of the sealed hall, and in one instance, in language that is direct enough to feel almost reckless, given the bureaucratic register surrounding it, the one that has not been satisfied. This case appears in the administrative records of the Karnak temple complex in texts that scholars date to the final decades of Ptolemaic administration, the last generations of the ancient priestly system before Roman annexation. Dissolved it, and it spans those decades in their entirety, covering approximately 40 years of continuous active notation. Fix 3 timeline anchor. In each reference, the case is recorded as active. In each reference, the assigned priesthood is documented as having conducted the prescribed rituals at the prescribed intervals. And in each reference, the outcome notation is identical. The situation remains unresolved. 40 years. The same notation, the same outcome, the same unresolved matter. Whatever was in the sealed hall had not accepted what the priests were offering, and the priests had not stopped trying, and nothing had changed, and the record simply continues, one notation after another, for 4 decades, documenting with perfect administrative consistency the failure to address something that the administration clearly understood, at some level, could not be refused indefinitely. The sealed hall itself is referenced in the records by a locational notation that corresponds, in the current archaeological mapping of the Karnak Mutt complex, to a cluster of subsidiary chambers in the southern precinct of the Mute enclosure. Some of these chambers have been excavated and formally catalogued. Others have been surveyed, but not fully investigated. And it is here, in the space between surveyed and investigated, that the account returns to where it opened, to the field journal from the late 1980s, to the single line, to the entry that stops. The excavation team working in that area of the southern precinct during that particular season was affiliated with a well-regarded European academic institution whose Egyptian fieldwork is otherwise extensively documented and whose publications from that period remain standard references in the archaeology of the late period. The field journals from that excavation season are archived and technically accessible to researchers. All of them are present and complete except for 3 consecutive days in the middle of the second week of the southern precinct work. The journals for those days are not there. Not torn out, the binding shows no sign of removal, no ragged edges, no residue of cut pages. The pages for those 3 days simply do not exist. The journal moves from one date directly to a date 4 days later, and the pages between are absent as though they were never produced. The team member whose handwriting fills the journal wrote on every other working day of the season. The gap is the only one in the entire record. Several members of that excavation team have been contacted over the years by independent researchers and journalists with an interest in the anomaly. Most declined to discuss it. One team member, speaking on background to a researcher in the early 2000s, said only that the chamber they found was in an unusual state of preservation and contained features of its interior that he did not wish to describe in detail, and that the decision not to formally document it had been made collectively and had not felt, at the time, like suppression. It had felt like the correct response to something that the available frameworks of their discipline were not designed to address. The researcher asked him to say more about the features of the interior. He ended the conversation. When the researcher contacted him again, he did not respond. When another researcher contacted him 3 years later, he responded briefly to say that he had nothing to add to what he had previously said, that he stood by the decision made at the time, and that he hoped the matter would not be pursued further. He did not say why he hoped this. The phrasing of the message suggests that the hope was not entirely for his own benefit. The physical site as it stands today shows no outward anomaly visible to a visiting observer. The area of the mutt enclosure that contains the southern precinct subsidiary chambers is partially accessible to researchers and partially restricted to those holding specific permits issued by the Egyptian authority responsible for antiquities management. The restricted area encompasses a cluster of chambers that includes the section corresponding to the locational notation in the priestly administrative records, the section that corresponds, as precisely as the mapping allows, to the sealed hall of the 40-year active case. Access to the specific cluster requires a formal application stating scholarly purpose and institutional affiliation. Applications for access, according to multiple researchers who have attempted the process, are not denied. Denial would require a decision, a stated reason, a document that would itself enter the record. Applications for access to the specific area are instead neither approved nor denied. They are received, they are acknowledged, and then they remain in a processing queue that does not move. Researchers who have followed up have been told that the application is under review. Further inquiries receive the same response. The review is ongoing. It has been ongoing in several documented cases for years. What the priests of the Specialized Ritual Office understood about the management of the unquiet dead was built on a foundation that is easy to mistake for superstition and harder, once examined, to dismiss as simply that. They understood that the dead who had not been satisfied required 2 conditions to sustain their activity in the world of the living. The first was the continuation of the original violation, the unrepaired tomb, the unrestored name, the undelivered restitution. The second was knowledge. The unquiet dead required that someone, somewhere, in some form, know that they were there. An abandoned spirit in a forgotten tomb with no living person aware of it was not, in the Egyptian understanding, a danger. It was simply a tragedy, a soul unable to move forward, isolated in the dark with its grievance and no audience for it. But the same spirit in a tomb that was known, watched, documented, visited, even visited by archaeologists who then decided not to publish their findings, was a different matter entirely. That spirit had an audience. That spirit's grievance had witnesses. And witnesses, in the Egyptian framework, carried a specific and not entirely comfortable relationship to the things they witnessed. To know about the unquiet dead was to be in contact with the unquiet dead. The priests accepted this as a professional condition. It was why the precautions existed. It was why the texts were held in closed hands rather than read aloud. It was why the door was left open only the width of a breath. The matter of the sealed hall was never formally closed in the priestly records. There is no notation in any surviving text indicating that the case was resolved, that the one who had not been satisfied had finally been satisfied, that the 40-year sequence of failed ritual attempts had at some point produced a different result. The administrative record ends not because the case was resolved, but because the administrative record itself ends the final decades of the Ptolemaic priestly system, giving way to Roman administration, the ancient temple hierarchy, dissolving not in a single moment of rupture, but in the slow institutional erosion of an organization that outlasted its political context by a generation and then could not outlast it any further. The case did not close. The system that was tracking it dissolved around it, and the unresolved matter remained in the sealed hall, unacknowledged by any functional ritual authority, in a chamber that the last people to enter it chose not to describe. The limestone of the Karnak complex does not change. It sits in the heat of the Nile Valley, as it has sat for 3,000 years, accumulating the slow chemistry of mineral time, its surfaces darkened by the oxidation of centuries, its carved reliefs worn at the high points, and preserved in the deep cuts where the chisel went furthest into the stone. At night, the heat releases from it in the way it has always released, slowly, steadily, a warmth that continues long after the source of it has gone. The air in the sealed subsidiary chambers of the southern precinct is still as it has always been still. Still in the specific way that these chambers were designed to be still. Still in the way that the ritual accounts describe, when the moment before the pressure change occurs, the held moment, the accumulation of density in the corridor, the specific quality of air that you feel in the chest before you hear anything. The corridor outside the sealed hall produces no echo now. It has not produced one for a very long time. The stone absorbs the sound before it can return, the way it absorbed the sound of every priest who walked that passage across 40 years of failed attempts, the way it absorbed whatever sounds the last people to enter the chamber made before they decided, collectively and without discussion, to leave and say nothing. The matter of the sealed hall remains, as it was always noted in the administrative records, unresolved. The one who has not been satisfied has been waiting, in one functional sense or another, for a very long time.